discussion forum post that's due on Friday, which will either add to what you already talked about or book one, or focus on something more specific in relation to book two. So we already talked about chapter one, and I've already established the main premise behind book two and how it was written later in Cervantes' life. After Don Quixote book one had already become famous, and how it's self-reflexive, how Don Quixote learns that and Sancho learn that these people have been writing a book about him, that Cervantes, under the guise of this Cide Hamet's Benengeli, has been writing a book about him, and they were unaware of this. And all of this becomes becomes revealed to Don Quixote in chapter 2. We learn more about Sancho's character, and it becomes Sancho and Don Quixote's characters become more developed and more complex in book 2, especially once they realize that they are characters within a work of fiction. And they start adapting to that idea. We see Sancho in part one, Don Quixote and Sancho. It seems like so many times that the work is just mainly criticizing them, and a lot of times just showing how dumb they are in order to make fun of them. But at the same time, there is this undercurrent of them having a type of wisdom. And that type of wisdom and that other side of them right there becomes more apparent as we move into book 2, as they become more musing. We learn about their camaraderie with one another, and that's one thing you can write a post about, is how the comparison contrast between these two, and that could be the source for that 30-point answer on your exam as well, comparing and contrasting Sancho and Don Quixote, or book 1 and book 2 of Don Quixote. Any of those elements are rife, or not rife, are good source material for that 30-point answer on the exam. One of the key differences between them is apparent in this chapter right here. Whenever Don Quixote talks to him in Latin, or a high or elevated language, we see Sancho says, "The only language I understand is my own." Sancho doesn't know his ABCs. He doesn't know how to read, how to write. And so he, again, is simple in this sense right here. But his simplicity doesn't keep him from being able to identify with Don Quixote. So even though Don Quixote is so different, even though he is so more learned, in a lot of ways, Sancho, in his common sense, grounds Don Quixote in moments like this. We also see how Sancho doesn't try to pretend to be something other than he is. In a lot of ways, he doesn't put on airs. He doesn't try to understand other languages. And we see also their relationship characterized in this chapter 2 on page 499, how they together go through all of these experiences. And Don Quixote talks about them as if they are one body. Don Quixote consistently refers to himself as the mind and Sancho as the body in this sense here. And how they both kind of suffer through this pain, even though sometimes it seems like one is going through more pain than the other. And this builds us up to where I left us last time, which is where Don Quixote learns about his exploits through the eyes of other people, and how that story of how other people see him is quite the contrast to his own idea of his own reality. Or their fictional retelling of his exploits is different from his own fictional idea of his exploits. Is another way to look at it if you're looking at it thematically. And I talked about last time, and I tried to relate it to this idea of social media and how people sometimes present different conceptions of themselves on social media, and how sometimes you'll see, like, for instance, uh, these Photoshop selfies and stuff like that through filters and stuff like that, and you're like, I've seen that person. That's not what that person looks like, you know. Uh, but in that person's mind, that's the fictional representation that they have of themselves. In one sense, that's real to them. That's how they conceive of themselves. It's more real to them and some people than how they see themselves in the mirror. There's some positive conceptions of that from a psychological standpoint. When you look at it in modern day psychology, people look at themselves as a mirror. Sometimes that causes depression and stuff like that. And this idea of constructing a second self, just like Don Quixote does, is healthy for him in a lot of ways. Because once that second self of Don Quixote dies at the end of this narrative we're going to read for next time, he dies. Once he stops seeing himself as this fictional second self, which is better than his real self, he dies. And so when you think about things like that, there's a lot of different second level connections to make. And that's also a thematic statement. A fictional self is necessary in order to promote our own health. That could be a thematic statement. As we read through this part right here, Don Quixote tries to reconcile this conception that society has of his self with his own conception that he has of himself. This is the conflict going on right here. Take a look at how he does that on this page 500 right here. He refuses to accept the way that other people see him. He compares himself with Julius Caesar and all of these things, which is mad and insane in one sense, but in the other sense, this is how he maintains his own sense of self-worth and self-dignity, okay? So sometimes you might argue that it's healthy to reject reality. This is why we reject reality. And in particular, in this passage, this is how we can reject real conceptions of ourselves that don't mesh with our own conception, which is more healthy for us. Although, of course, with Cervantes' work, there's always an although. In this case here, the although is that sometimes it's not so healthy for Don Quixote to adopt this second self. But in book 2, it becomes less of a problem. He gets beat up much less in book 2. He learns that somebody has written about him. And it brings up this question, what is real? What is my reality? And I asked the question last time, have you ever went out and done something and lived your life and thought that you were living your life just fine, but then somebody made a post on social media or said something about gossip, or gossip got to your ears? It doesn't have to be social media. The way that we used to do this was just gossip. People would talk to each other after church or whatever, and they would get in and be like, what? I didn't do that. That's not me. That's not what I intended. And Don Quixote has this existential moment. And really, that is one of the primary thematic topics that this work explores, which is the metaphysical self. Metaphysical. What does it mean to be me? This logical question. These are a lot of philosophical terms, and I'll write them here in the in the chat right here. Ontological. This term ontological has to do with to be. What does it mean to be? What does it mean? And then you can add to that. What does it mean? What does it mean to be me? Okay. We have this idea of this world right here in which we exist We all have an idea of what it means to be me. These are ontological questions. What does it mean to be, in one sense? What does it mean to exist? Okay? And then the next question is, what does it mean to be me? Okay? Because it can mean something different to exist, right? Because we all exist. We all have this experience of existence, which involves I'm alive, I'm a living thing, I'm a thinking thing, I'm going to die, I am going to perhaps love, I have desires. All of these things are common to being things, to living things. But then it's quite a different thing to ask this self, what does it mean to be me? Okay, me. And so this involves questions of identity. And when we consider our identity, and this is a new thing, a relatively new thing in modern in the modern world, it's going to be expressed soon by John Locke and cats like that. This idea of a self. Who am I? And does that self of who I am exist outside of society, exist outside of what other people conceive of me? How do I go about constructing that self? All of these are essential questions to Don Quixote, and it's one of the reasons why this work is so cutting edge at that time period. It anticipates all of these different theories of identity and ontology as well. Some of the things I put right here. How do we react when we realize we become a story in someone else's words? How do we reconcile these different versions of ourselves? How do we fight against those versions? That's what Don Quixote is going to do in this work right here. He says, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to give them 1,000 more adventures to rival the ones that I've had before. So Don Quixote and Sancho and Sanson Carrasco is going to be a key character more so in this portion of the work right here. He comes into play toward the end of the work. He serves as a sounding board for Don Quixote as well, and he's going to be one of the characters who tries to bring Don Quixote back home and back to his senses. So in this sense here, look at how Don Quixote reacts to learning the fact that he has been part of a book right here. He can't persuade himself that a history of himself exists. The blood of his enemies was yet dry on his blade, and people were already claiming that its noble deeds had appeared in print. And so this confirms to him that he is and is being followed by sage enchanters. To Don Quixote, this only confirms to him the fact that people are watching him. You ever met anybody who's paranoid and thinks that people are constantly watching them? Well, so they're trying constantly to fight against that fact that people are watching them. And so they post things on Facebook saying, I do not give Facebook permission to, to use my personal information, and they make a post about that, and then you're like, well, just by having that app on your phone right there, and by posting, you are giving them permission, to do these things. They say, I'm not going to take the vaccine because I'm going to get this microchip implanted that's going to track my every move, but then you realize there's this phone right here that has a GPS that's tracking your every move already. And so, to Don Quixote, he is a man who thinks that he's being followed and people are manipulating his reality all the time. But in actuality, there's this thing that's behind him that's, he gets confirmation, the fact that somebody's watching over him. And he doesn't realize that he's in a book itself, and me and you and Gabe and all these characters are watching over him constantly. But it confirms to him the fact that somebody's following him. And so this is how he reacts to it. he criticizes the author of the work right here, which becomes an incredibly self-reflexive self-criticism by Cervantes. It's like one of the things that's so fascinating about this work right here is that Cervantes allows his fictional characters to be themselves. He confirms that a work of fiction and the characters in a work of fiction have their own agency. So he allows them to be themselves. He gives them freedom to even criticize him. And so that's one of the ways in which his work is so cutting edge here. It's that he affirms their selves and their autonomy. You could compare this, if you're trying to get a thematic statement out of that, I mean, you can compare it to having a child. Cervantes at the beginning of this work says, I am not the father of this work, I'm the stepfather. In many ways, creating a work of fiction is like becoming a father. It's like becoming a mother, It's becoming a parent, right? And you can either say, these characters in this work of fiction are mine, I control them, I am the author and finisher of their faith, I do everything, and I control everything in this work of fiction. You can say that, and that's what all authors before Cervantes said. Or you can say, they're their own children, I can't control them. Once they leave this page and become a printed book, okay, and there's a book over there, there's a book over here, you have your own mind, I have my own mind, y'all folks online as well have your own minds. Y'all read that character and you read it differently. You have your own ability to interpret that work of literature in a different sense than everybody else. These characters have their own freedom to do whatever they want, in the same sense that a child, no matter how hard you try to control that child, no matter how hard I try to teach Brooklyn to love books, she still doesn't like books all that much. Brooklyn was here the other day, but she does like comic books. So I'm hoping one day that builds into a like of books, right? But ultimately, she's her own person. I can't control her. But Cervantes acknowledges this. He acknowledges that in a work of fiction, and to broaden that beyond just writing, in a work of art, in a work of something that we create, whether it be a work of art or whether it be a child, we ultimately can't control all of these things. All of these things are beyond our control. No matter how hard we try, it's beyond our control. And so that's one of the things going on in this work right here. He recognizes that the characters are not within his control because of various factors that we talked about. And he kind of praises that. He kind of gives into it. He allows them that freedom, and he revels in it. It's not really a lament in this case here. Okay, some other things going on page 504. It's really interesting, this back and forth between truth and fiction. And this back and forth between Don Quixote realizing that the world that he is creating is both false, but also at the same time true. He kind of goes back and forth about this idea here. And I've talked about it in previous times. One of the ways in which he reconciles it is that he says, it may not be true in your reality, but it's true in my reality. It can't be any less true to me. And another things is that he talks about this idea of histories. And he says, and about how works of fiction and how the characters within those works of fiction are not true to life, even though they seem like true to life. And for Don Quixote, that idea of them seeming true to life is more important to him than them actually being true to life. And all of these are different ontological questions. And I just typed this idea into the chat box right there, this idea between seeing and being. And this is one of the ultimate ontological questions is, are we what we seem to be? Are what we be actually what we seem to be? And should it be, you know? Or is being always different from seeming? I know these are really weird ways of phrasing things, and all of this comes up to Heidegger's thought. All of this is kind of referencing philosophical questions that are raised by Martin Heidegger, who is a famous existential philosopher in the 20th century. And this work predates a lot of his ideas that he presents as well. So if you want to know more about this idea, explore it further in Heidegger's work. Bless you. All right, let's skip forward a little bit further. Don Quixote continues to talk about the author of his history, and he criticizes the author of his history, which in one sense, you could say it undermines himself and his own authenticity. But on the other hand, you could say because undermine his own authenticity is because if Cervantes is not a good author, then Don Quixote is not a good character. But on the other hand, Don Quixote is arguing that he's a good character in contrast to how the author presents him. So it's going to be up to Don Quixote to prove him wrong. So all of this kind of builds up to, in my opinion, what Don Quixote does in chapter 17 of this work here. So let's just go ahead and start skipping forward to that. Okay, so in book 1, Don Quixote was presented took on the moniker of the Knight of the Sorry Face. And I talked about last time how that came about because he kept getting beat up and he lost basically all his teeth. And I compared him to a battered emoji in that sense right there. The Knight of the Sorry Face is how I imagined him. Don Quixote in book 2, he takes on an actual lion in book 17 here. And Cervantes says in the preface to this chapter about events that revealed the highest peak ever reached by Don Quixote's unprecedented courage and the happily concluded adventure of the lions. In this chapter, chapter 17, Don Quixote changes from the Knight of the Sorry Face to the Knight of the Lions, which is that term right there reflects perhaps how he begins to see himself and how others might begin to see him in a more glorified fashion, kind of reflecting what he wants people to see him as. In this chapter here, he does what almost all other histories of knight-errants that he's read about do. Those knight-errants go out, and at some point, it's a very common thing for them to fight a lion in some way. Now, it's one thing for Don Quixote to run around saying, I am a knight, and all of these various things, and pretend to be a knight, but him actually going against an actual lion and facing that lion right there is a true test of his courage and also a true test of his belief in his own fiction. If you can't, it raises the question, if you can't believe in your own fiction, if you can't believe in your own sense of self that you invent, then who will, you know? And Don Quixote proves the authenticity of his belief in his own fiction by facing this lion here. People keep trying to talk him out of fighting this lion. And some of them talk some sense. One of them says, Sir Knight, knights errant should undertake adventures that offer some chance of success, and not those that are utterly hopeless, because courage that crosses the border into foolhardiness has more of insanity than fortitude about it. So it brings up this idea we brought about earlier, the difference between courage and foolishness. And Don Quixote, this is one of the things that he struggles with. And what I do from his mind is, what I'm doing truly courageous, or is it foolish right here? And some people would argue it's truly foolish, but Quixote would say it's actually courageous. And Sancho, he keeps going back and forth between saying that Don Quixote is crazy versus he's actually truly speaking sense. And that's kind of the case for just about everybody in this work right here. At one point, they'll think he's crazy. Another point, they think that he's sane. So it's a matter of perception, and there's no certainty. And that's another one of the thematic things that are going on in this work right here. This idea that there are no things that are truly certain in life. There are no things that are that we can truly find one way of viewing them. It's all a matter of perspective. And this is, again, this is one of the concepts of modernism that are starting to emerge at this time. And Cervantes is way before it actually becomes more popular. On 595, this is again still chapter 17. Don Quixote shows how courageous he is in fighting this lion. He drops his lance, he drops his shield, and he only holds his sword, because he knows that Rocinante is not brave enough to face this lion, but he is. And it says, with wonderful courage and a valiant heart to confront the cart, fervently committing himself to God and then to his lady Dulcinea. Inside Hamet Benengeli includes a generous extolling of Don Quixote as well. And you look at how this lion itself, the sight of which would have struck terror into temerity itself. So that lion is genuinely, it's a real thing. It is genuinely terrifying. And Don Quixote genuinely faces this real thing with absolute bravery. But then what happens is Don Quixote could put his self to test. He could fight this lion here, but the lion, by chance, more inclined to civility than despotism, wouldn't take any notice of Don Quixote. And having looked this way and that, it turned around, showed Don Quixote his backside, with the utmost composure and deliberation, lay itself down again. So the lion ignores Don Quixote. Once it opens up the cage and he could maul him, he chooses to ignore him. And this creates a type of absurdity of Don Quixote's bravery when the lion won't face him. So it implies that no matter how brave we are, sometimes those circumstances don't arise to put our bravery to the test. In this case here. And they make the argument that saves him here. It's the keeper of the lion says, you've shown what a great-hearted man you are. No brave champion, as far as I can see, is obliged to do any more challenge his enemy and wait him in the field. If the enemy doesn't present himself, he's the one that's disgraced. Don Quixote accepts that reasoning, Uh, and he says to shut the door, and the lion doesn't maul him. And DQ says right here on page 597 at the end, are there any enchantments that can contend with true valor? Those enchanters can take my happiness away from me if they like, but they can never deprive me of my resolve and courage. That's a good point right there. Cervantes can present Don Quixote however he wants, and Cervantes is the ultimate enchanter in this work right here. But he can never deprive him of resolve and courage. That's one thing that Don Quixote has that the author cannot take away from him. If he feels that in his heart that he is truly courageous, then that can't be taken away from him. And Don Diego, who watches all of this, says the same thing that I was talking about earlier. He regarded him as a sane man with madness in him and as a madman with sane tendencies. So again and again, we see characters doing that. And Don Diego says he sometimes thinks he's mad and sometimes he thinks he's elegant. It's interesting to see how Don Quixote presents his own conception of what he did right here. Who can doubt, Don Diego, what your opinion of me is that I am a man who is both foolish and mad. And so Don Quixote defends himself right here, 598. This is the only conclusion that you can draw from your deeds. So he's self-reflective here. He says, I know you probably think I'm mad. You probably think I'm foolish here. In spite of all that, I should like you to observe that I'm not as mad or foolish as I must have seemed. It's a fine sight to see a gallant knight in the presence of his king, in the middle of all of these things, aiming his lance with perfect aim at a brave bull. And it's nice to see him fight in front of nice ladies and all of these things in order to entertain them but it's a different thing for that knight to actually go out into the wilderness and do all of these things and gain lasting fame by facing the lion face to face. He says every knight has a part to play. But the knight errant must search out all of these problems, and at every step attempt the impossible. He must not be alarmed by lions or dismayed by monsters, because seeking these, attacking those, and defeating them all is his principal occupation. And he says that attacking these lions a moment ago was therefore something I had to do, even though I was well aware it was foolhardy beyond measure. For I know what courage is. It's a virtue situated, and I think this is the important part I wanted you to key in on right here. I knew that it was foolhardy, but I know what courage is. It's a virtue situated between two extremes, the vices of cowardice and foolhardiness. But it's less reprehensible for the man who is courageous to rise up as far as the extreme of foolhardiness than to sink down to the extreme of cowardice. And Diego replies after that, after everything you've said, I see, after it's been balanced in the right reason, that if the rules of knight errantry were ever lost, they could be recovered from your breast as they are a repository and archive. So Don Quixote ends this episode here. Almost every other book right here presented him almost always negatively. But in this case here, he ends this episode being admired truly, authentically by someone, and he's renamed the Knight of the Lions. And I think what's important about that is going to anticipate the things that I will finish up our discussion with next time, which is when Don Quixote and Sancho Panza run into the Duke and Duchess in chapters 30 through 31. which I had you to read this time as well. And what's so interesting about this episode in Book 2 is that the Duke and Duchess have read Book 1 of Don Quixote. And so they know who Sancho Panza is, and they know who Don Quixote is, and they decide that they're going to play a trick on these two, and they're going to pretend that they are, in fact, a knight errant and a squire who are worthy of honor and respect. And they're going to authenticate everything that Don Quixote believes about himself. He's going to go to their country estate, and instead of him imagining that it's a castle, they're going to, in fact, make it a castle for him. Instead of imagining that he's being attended by lords and ladies when he goes to the inn in Book 1, when he's actually being treated by prostitutes and things like that. In this case here, they're going to authenticate him and say, hey, no, you are a knight errant. We're going to treat you that way. And it's interesting to see how that changes his own conception of himself. And the Duke and Duchess also are going to tell Sancho Panza that he deserves the reward that Don Quixote has always told him he should get. Okay? They're going to say, we're going to give you that governorship that you always wanted. And it's going to be fascinating to see how Sancho Panza reacts to the fact that he has been named a governor, and then he's going to actually go and try to govern this. It's really a pretend island government that he's not really in charge of, but he thinks he's in charge of it here. It's going to be interesting to see how he goes about enacting these laws and how these laws are actually very sensible, and Don Quixote's own sensible advice that he gives to Sancho Panza. But finally, I want to leave us with this thought right here to connect the dots of what I've been arguing. On page 689 in chapter 30, we see how the Duke and Duchess continue to call Don Quixote at the beginning the Knight of the Sorry Face. But we see Sancho continuously, he stands up for his master right here. He says, no, he is the Knight of the Lions. So he's trying to present an argument that Don Quixote is becoming more authentic, more like a real knight than he was in Book 1. And he's doing that face to face with these people right here in chapter 30, who are in essence mocking them and having really good fun of him. So that's worth noting. Let's make sure everybody knows what to read for next time. It's listed in the announcement that I posted and also in the syllabus. You can see what to read and be